Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Future Transportation discussion panel. You've heard all week about how energy powers the economy. This session is more focused on how transportation, which is essentially the lifeblood of the economy, especially for urban economies, because of the way it enables the movement of goods and people and services. Now, some might argue that technology is increasingly taking over the services side of what makes cities economically viable, but I would argue, and I'm sure a lot of you may agree, especially in the developing economies context, transportation becomes one of the primary infrastructures that cities have to leverage their wealth and human capital into an economic output. So with that focus of this meeting set, my name is Dilip Kapoor. I'm with Atkins. And currently, I'm with the Central Planning Office in Qatar, where we are on the client side, enabling and helping the state of Qatar deliver what is one of an unprecedented scale transport portfolios ahead of the 2022 Football World Cup. And while we're doing that, we're also enabling the institutional capacity of the government of Qatar to deliver and run such transportation portfolios in the future. What I would like to do now is to invite the panelists to please come up on stage so they can each also then introduce themselves. Any order. This is going to be an informal discussion. It's an intimate group, so I would invite you to, all of you, to interact as much as you choose to. So without much ado, if I may start with the lady, please introduce yourselves.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Julie Larnout. I'm Vice President from Nantes Métropole, which is a city that encounters around 600,000 inhabitants in Nantes and is growing really fast. Mm-hmm. So we have to take that into account to encounter and to face the next the development issue and the urban development issue that we discussed this morning. And transport is certainly a part of that.
Thank you very much, Julie. I think the issue of fast growth is going to be something that significantly impinges on future transport's capability to deal with it. So that'll be an issue that we will discuss as we go along. Welcome.
I'm Peng Yu Zhu from Master Institute of Science and Technology. I just joined the institute in August last year, so I'm kind of new to UAE, to this region as well. I will address the questions do my best.
Absolutely. And I also understand, Dr. Zhu, that your area of specialization is in transportation and urban development policy and economics. And this is something that we will come to as we address the issues of how those issues interact when it comes to transportation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Gerard Ostheimer. I serve as the global lead for sustainable bioenergy for the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. I'm sure that the actual lead of SE for All would be surprised to hear that I was leading the whole thing. In the Sustainable Bioenergy Group, we are interested in promoting the development and deployment of sustainable bioenergy solutions to help achieve the goals of universal energy access and doubling the use of renewables, which are two of the three goals of the Sustainable Energy for All initiative.
Thank you very much, Jerry, Macaulay Jerry.
Sure.
Now that's something that I guess we'll get to towards the later portion of the discussion about the energy transformation and what governments can do to enable that. Welcome to the panel, please.
Thank you, Dilip. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jean-François Argence. I manage the new mobilities department of a French company, a law company, which is a world leader in the transportation system.
Thank you. Welcome, Jean-François.
Thank you.
My first question or issue might actually start with yourself, Jean-François. Now, loosely speaking, personal mobility is what you would call conventional transport. Since cities have always existed, there has been personal mobility of some sort. whether it is just people walking around or whether it then became horse-driven carriages. But what we're talking about now is what is conventionally called the automobile industry. My question to you in particular, but then I'll open this up to the panel to weigh in on what are the key issues in your perspective that are affecting the transformation of the personal mobility sector? And if I may follow that up with a closely tagged question, what is it that governments can do to expedite that transformation?
Well, it's an interesting question. What we can attend from the authorities and public transport policies is to understand that we need we need a panel of public transport solution. There is no only one good and unique solution. There is a panel. So in this panel, we have, of course, what the most famous are the mass transit system, metro, tramway, BRT system. But there is also what we call the last mile problematic, which is the one for the one we involve in a new transport system, which is called the Crystal. Perhaps we will speak about this. And for us, it's important to understand and not to forget this last part of the whole need of a public transport system.
Mm-hmm. I might open this up to the other panelists as well, in case you have anything to add, with the emphasis on power supply and alternative energies and how it connects with private transportation. Please, Julie.
I just wanted to say that transport is one, for Nantes Métropole, it accounts for about a third of its greenhouse gas emissions, which is kind of similar in different cities of the world. But the issue is that we have the solutions when regarding energy supply or heating or retrofitting. But for transport, we are still searching for an alternative to petrol, because we have built our system, we have urbanized our cities in such a way that we need a car or trucks to move around goods or to move around ourselves. There are alternatives, and we're developing them within the urban area. It's more easy to promote bicycle, to promote walking or public transportation. But still, you see, for the economic sector in particular, for the last kilometer, how do you provide your city centers with the good and the supplies they need for that last kilometer without going into the city center by trucks? So there are some solutions still to be developed, I think, in particular on the transport sector.
Please, Jerry.
Sort of building on both of these points, I think absolutely we're going to be looking at a panel of solutions. And something to think about when we think about urban, or when I think about urban centers or urban planning, you're sort of thinking about the city as a self-enclosed island, which of course it isn't. Right? So cities actually, there's a tremendous flow between cities, and there's a tremendous flow every day of goods into cities. Just think about how much food has to go into a large city on any given day. So there's a diffusion there that's happening that has to be literally fueled. And so as we look forward and we think about the roles that biomass and bioenergy can play, we're looking forward to more of a niche role. So one could imagine personal vehicles getting smaller, lighter, more efficient, electrified. But if we consider like one of the dominant intercity forms of communication, say aviation, because of the weight burden of batteries, we're not going to have electrified airplanes anytime soon. And in fact, just yesterday, the UAE from Masdar announced a very exciting development where there's at the Masdar Institute there, they've started construction of a research facility looking at the ability to grow bioenergy crops here using saltwater irrigation. And it's actually a very clever systems approach that starts with food production in the form of aquaculture, shrimp and fish, wastewater flowing out of that, bringing nutrients to these plants that actually produce an oil seed, and then a final purification step by mangroves. And so you have a situation where even here we can transition to away from pure fossil intercity transport to a hybrid between fossil and a renewable fuel for intercity transport.
Thank you very much. We have a pretty intimate group here, so instead of doing the conventional panel and then opening up to questions, if any of you feel at any point in time that you want to jump in, please raise your hand so I can see you and we can do a back and forth with the audience, if that may work for you. Do you have any questions at this point? Anybody? If not, I'll just continue to the next question, which a number of the panelists have now identified the issue of public transportation. Now, especially when it comes to developing cities in the developing economy, or more relevant to here, cities in this part of the world, the revealed demand, as you say, in terms of what the likely uptake of public transport is very minimal. So there is always this chicken and egg relationship between when do cities invest in these expensive public transport, possibly expensive public transport alternatives, and when do they change behavior, when do they note change in demand from the public in general? So this is an open question to the panel, and you may all please take turns to answer this. What insights can you bring to how cities should address this chicken and egg issue on public transport and the related feeder systems to it? Dr. Zhu, you might want to start with this.
Okay, so this is kind of the traditional urban economics topic that people will be discussing. And I think, the simple answer would be providing economic incentives and disincentives for people, including by providing subsidies, taxation, and regulations. The first point, if we want to do subsidy, mainly for the public transportation system, we know that in countries like UAE and United States, driving has been heavily subsidized actually for quite a long time because the gasoline price is very cheap. And also the highway system, it's almost free. So, it's called a freeway in the US, but it doesn't mean it's the original idea of the term. It's you can drive freely on the highway without reducing your speed. But gradually people think of freeway as it's free. And you can see that, from the subsidy of driving, it creates a lot of externalities. And we know if there's negative externality, the free market is not going to produce the most efficient outcomes. So in this sense, we need to kind of do a series of actions, including the points I mentioned, the subsidy and also the regulations. And for the public transportation system, the transit system, there are countries like in the US, we pay for gasoline prices, we pay for gasoline at the gas pump, and every dollar we paid for that, I think for every gallon of gas you pump, you pay 18 cents of excise tax poured into the Federal Highway Trust Fund. And there's also numerous states that also charge the excise tax on top of the federal excise tax. And with this money, we can fund the public transportation system. So actually, they have a branch account called the Transit Fund from the Highway Trust Fund, which we can use for funding all the public transportation transit system in the states. And this kind of funding, certainly we can view it as a way of providing subsidy to the transit system. And then this kind of relates to the second point of we should also provide, kind of use taxation, use the toll system to kind of increase the cost of driving. Towing, I realize in UAE, towing is really not much for the highway system. I think we pay 5 dirhams or 3 dirhams for each time when we go to Dubai, and within Abu Dhabi we don't pay any tolls. This is quite similar situation to the US, where you don't pay tolls in most of the highways, interstate highways. And the toll system can kind of, I would say, differentiate between people's time, value of time. For example, there are HOT lanes currently being constructed or converted from HOV to high occupancy toll lanes in Southern California, including San Diego. I was just traveling over there a month ago, and some of the high occupancy vehicle lanes, now you actually can pay a toll to go on these lanes during peak hours, and they could be using dynamic pricing models to charge you a different fee depending on the time that you are using the HOT lane. And if you don't want to pay the toll, you can still use the regular lanes, but it's just going to be slower traffic. That gives people opportunities and alternatives, to be using these different lanes. And then the last point I think relates more about the regulation. Regulation, we can think about, for example, parking. There are cities that still providing a lot of free parking, street parking. And there are places like in Manhattan area, you pay quite a lot for parking there over a day. And I think gradually a lot of the apartment, and this kind of relates to real estate development and urban planning as well. Previously in a lot of the cities, we have the minimum parking standards for these apartment constructions, meaning that if you build a 2-bedroom apartment, you have to provide at least 2 parking spaces. But now some cities are actually thinking more smart. They changed the standards to be maximum parking standards. If you are building a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom apartment, the most parking spaces you can provide is 1 parking space. Well, certainly that a lot of real estate developers doesn't like the idea, but it restricts parking so that the demand for driving can be kind of reduced. And I leave that.
I appreciate that. I think a lot of the points you've raised address if you were to use the loose analogy of carrot and stick kind of measures to encourage behavior change. It focuses on the regulatory or the control side. If I may point the same question to Julie, who's now dealing with a city which is fast growing. So it's more about capturing those early behaviors before they may have been entrenched. So what may be some of the carrot side of this managing demand for transport, which is less on punitive approaches, but maybe more on encouragement? Any thoughts on that?
Well, the whole fact that cities are a key actor in tackling climate change is that they can act, such as on public transport, but they can try to influence the behavior of people living in its city. I think that's the major point of the cities. It has been raised this morning as well, is how can you make people, not only the city smart, but the people smart as well in their behavior. It is clear that for us, for the transport, we don't want to have a punitive approach. So we don't want to restrict more the car from the city. But we have a different approach because in France we have the luxury of having a big country, so having a lot of space to urbanize. Hence we have a lot of areas that are just a bit on the American, based on the American model, that we have big malls on the outskirts of the cities, and the cities are expanding. So what we're doing, we're really rethinking globally the urban planning agenda of our city, and thus we are restricting, so we can't really construct on areas that haven't been urbanized yet. We can densify because we have cities that are growing older with buildings that are less efficient, energy efficient. So we can rebuild the city on the city. We have particular clauses that we're trying to put in to say when you want to build a new area, you have to have it linked by public transport. So that because it wasn't, beforehand, it wasn't a logical system. We would just build a new area and build a new road to go there. And so to reverse the logic and say you cannot build a new area if it is not linked to public transport, and thus densify our city. So we kind of try to reverse the thinking, because we have, we were one of the first cities in France to reinstore the trolley, Yeah,
Tram, yeah.
tramway.
Mhm.
And we have been developing fast, and our public transport is very costly, in fact, for our local government, and it is expanding because there is more and more demand. So we need to address that question by providing a high quality service. Because if the public transport is not of a high quality service, people will tend to use it less. And then we have to move to the other things, that is to expand the bicycle tracks and the walking to be able. And we are, just the last point, we are also reducing the speed limits within the city and proving that it is healthier, less costly, and quicker to go by another means of transport than by car.
Thank you.
If we look around, so if we look around it in a more developing country context, if we look at some of the bigger cities in Africa, Delhi, Manila, etc., when I think of transport, I think of both sort of formal public transportation in the form of diesel buses, and then I also think of the very informal transportation, the sort of the minivans that you see just packed with people, transporting people on their long commutes. And again, I think these are largely diesel driven. I think I'm going to be a little provocative here. I'm going to say that, given the emissions, given both the particulate black carbon and fossil carbon dioxide emissions, that there's probably a genuine opportunity for tapping into some of the emerging climate financial instruments to decarbonize this sector by having cities transition to perhaps an electric tram on the surface or even an underground at some point. And I'm curious, it would be fascinating to know if there's any cities that are actually looking to tap into the Green Climate Fund to do that. And then as an intermediate step, one could imagine leveraging the fact that buses and public transportation use a central fueling facility to convert them to cleaner fuels. And these cleaner fuels can take many different shapes. It could be compressed natural gas. Scania actually has a large engine, a bus engine that runs on 95% ethanol, and emissions basically is water, and very low particulate emissions. It still emits carbon dioxide, but if it's renewable ethanol, then you have then you are achieving two goals at the same time. So I think that a major challenge facing a developing country context is transitioning their formal and informal surface transport into a lower carbon model initially, and then maybe into a electrified public utility, that's the wrong word, but an electrified mass
Public
transit
service
system
almost, yes.
later.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Please, could we get a microphone here, please?
Just a quick question. One of the things that I think London has done very well, and you see it in Boston and elsewhere in the States, is Zipcar, sharing cars. I mean, this is how we go to electric cars in cities very easily. And quite honestly, when you lived in London, you didn't need to own a car. The car was just outside your flat. You just put your iPhone by the window and away you go.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great to figure out how to transition that in a developing country context. I don't know what the solution, but there's probably is. Their informal transport is very, I'm sure it's not particularly efficient, and having an IT, but everybody has a phone, so having some sort of IT connection to that might make it, as a first step, to make it more efficient.
If I may jump in on this as well, there is the idea of getting efficiencies and operational efficiencies from what you would call conventional transport, and cars, and converting electric cars to electric cars because there's a preference for cars, which is a behavioral trait, is something that is an incremental change, a pragmatic but nonetheless an incremental change, which is necessary. But on the other side are the more expensive, heavily capital expense oriented, but still the backbone of this behavior change, like the rail-oriented public transport, whether they are metros, the regional rail discussions. Aviation was one thing Jerry mentioned. So the topic that we're talking about is travel demand management, as to how do people go about doing conventional travel, and how does the energy transformation enable people to move differently. The point, without having, I don't know if there was a question in your comment. It sounded like there was an observation.
Yeah, it was an observation. I just think one needs to get away from owning the means of transport.
Yes.
And this is our point about public transport, that it's shared. And in an urban environment, we have to be in a shared public space. Okay, there are situations when, if you live outside of the city and you've got a big family, but if you live in a densely urban area, to be honest, you do not need to own a motor car today. The technology is there, it saves money, parking, all the issues that we have to deal with. This is how we transition quickly to electric vehicles in the larger cities. Anyway, that's just an opinion.
No, appreciate that, yeah. There was an issue there which I might want to just underplay, because we're talking about transport, but transport is a subset of a much wider issue with cities, which is how do we develop? A couple of our panelists, both Julie and Dr. Zhu, touched upon the notion of land use planning, because effectively, primary assets that cities have is land and space. So the way that space is managed through regulatory control over whether it was housing policies or just development policies is what creates the shape of the city, and the transport infrastructure then kind of holds it together as a backbone to enable the kinds of, let's say, opportunistic movements that you was talking about. Technology is important, and that's an evolving place, but I personally believe that the pragmatic, solution-oriented space is a hybrid of optimal public transport, which then has a nested series of integrated alternative modes. A number of, I think Jean-François talked about some of the electric vehicle opportunities for the last mile, which connect up with that system, and then using technology to leverage off of it. But I appreciate the comment on this. There was a question here, if I don't see clearly.
I think London is a very good example of providing a very good public sector transportation. So if you want to get away from private cars, you need to provide that first. And the difficulty is the investment required, irrespective of the land use, whatever it is actually having a reliable service that provided to you similar to the car. It doesn't have to be this, exactly that, but similar to the car. And that will be a transition for us. So examples, Hong Kong as well, Singapore and so forth. These are the cities that are transitioning from the car to a public transport arena.
Can I address this?
Please.
I think this goes back to your question pretty well, because again, this is really the demand and supply side. As going back to my points of incentives and disincentives, I think London and even Boston is kind of different. Boston is, in the US, is considered as one of the 4 transit heritage cities. It was built like with one center, urban center, kind of like centric kind of circle. But in a lot of cities in the US, the problem with people's behavior is that driving is so cheap. And even though public transit agencies have been trying to providing very good services, people don't want to use it because that's exactly because driving is cheap and driving is subsidized. They use their car. When I was living in Los Angeles, I had a Zip car just parked underneath my apartment, on the street. It's street parking as well. Sometimes I complain it's taking my spot because I usually park there, but like 2 years later, the city dedicated that spot for Zip car. And I don't see a lot of people are using it. I don't use it very often because, first it's a reliability issue, and because sometimes you don't find a Zip car when you want to use it. Then you mess up your appointment, and then you have to take a taxi. And the second point is, if I own my own car, parking in Los Angeles is not that much. I think I pay $100 a month for parking in the downtown area for my apartment. But in other places it can be much more than that. Then people might be thinking about, okay, I maybe need to give up my car and use public transit more often. So it's again, it's really the incentive and disincentive points of view. And I think it's really great for cities and government to provide alternatives for people, whoever wants to use the Zip car or electricity car or public transportation. But the bottom line is we also need to think about how we can change people's behavior.
Geoffroy, what
Yes,
did you add
just
to
want to add a point and to answer to your question before. I think we can, government or local government can be punitive, can have punitive policy if they propose high performances public transport solution. That's what some of the cities, as Nantes or Strasbourg in France, has done with success. So it was, you're right, if it's cheap to take its own car, if it's faster, even if you have a high performances on the tramway network, modern, etc., comfortable, people will continue to take a private car because it's easier and cheaper. But if it began to be complicated, expensive, no public place in the center of the city, they will say, okay, I will take the alternative. It seems to be fast and comfortable. So I think we can. There are two conditions: the alternative, which has to be successful, but also perhaps sometimes local policy has to be ambitious at this point.
I think the point of ambition is taken very well, especially in this part of the world where a lot of the cities and countries are leading by example by setting not only very aggressive targets in terms of whether it's the Expo in Dubai or whether it's the World Cup in Qatar or events like this here in Abu Dhabi, the emphasis on tailoring these kind of global thought leadership discussions into a local action space is something that is increasingly being felt, and that is only a good thing. So thank you for that. Julie, it looks like you want to add something to this.
I would just wanted to add, because there are two issues at stake. There's one option that is we don't rethink our way of moving, and we still use the car, but we just put something else into it than petrol. So we go to electric vehicles. Or there is behavioral change. That is, we go to another way of thinking how to move ourselves. And I just wanted to give a note of hope because I'm half Dutch, and in Holland, you all may think that we were born on bikes. For me, it's a fact, but for the generation before me, it wasn't. It was really the national government who said, well, either we go for nuclear power again, or we rethink our energy system, and so we look into a different way of transportation. But that means that we have everything we need in our compounds, and we can do everything by bike. And I just wanted to add just one last thing, because you launched, you introduced it well. It is that we do need, as local governments, to act more together, and all the non-state actors, because we talked about UN Habitat this morning, we talked about COP21 and what it gives as an incentive for the local actors to act, because we are key actors. And so I just wanted to say that we in Nantes are building the first global summit on climate action that is called Climate Chance at the end of September, and I'll have some leaflets. So if you want, because I think what we need to do is get this dynamic between actors to create solutions, to exchange, because there are some things we can do. And we need more cooperation between cities in the northern part and in the south. That's one part of the Convention of Mayors that was raised before. That's the Pact of the Mayors at the European level. And we have a new Convention of Mayors with new targets. And it includes also decentralized cooperation, because cities cannot pay to or abund the fund, but they can exchange on how to do the urban planning, or on some energy solutions they can provide for other cities in the south.
Again, looks like there's a couple of questions in the audience. Can we start here, please?
I'm Nicolas Alien from AED. So my question is, looking at different countries, so how do we integrate this infrastructure like roads who are not really well developed or constructed yet, or also the fact that for electric cars that will be way in the future because we don't have power 24 hours a day or full coverage. So how do we integrate that into fresh transportation for those kind of situations? Thank you.
I'm going to ask for my apologies sincerely, but I wasn't able to capture the question.
Okay,
so
let me rephrase it.
please.
I'm trying to use my best English here. So how do we integrate lack of infrastructure, road infrastructure, into planning for future transportation for countries like my country where we have issues with road itself? And also, a lot of those countries are using second-hand cars, used cars, so what is the policy for that also? Thank you.
So if I understand right, the question is focusing on the emphasis on especially countries which are struggling with resource abundance. How is it that they are able to leverage the issues that we've been talking about with an emphasis on development and growth around transportation? Is that right? Yes. Panelists? Anybody want to take that? I may take a stab at that ourselves because one of the things that what you would call developing countries, from the parlance of the economic construct of that phrase, struggle with the idea of regulations per se. Institutions are not necessarily mature in these cities. A lot of it is led through the private sector. A lot of development is led through the private sector. So the ability to get the right kind of collaborative behaviors and identifying the key stakeholders in those kind of developing countries, whether they are certain industry sectors or whether they are key players in the political arena of that country, identifying their vested interests and quickly translating that down into a series of fundamental projects, because nothing galvanizes action like clarity of purpose. So getting those countries to understand that there's a common benefit in collectively identifying a few easy achievements, which then leverage the human capital of the overall city, is a good place to start. However, funding will always be the issue. Innovative funding mechanisms, which might be the last question of our session, could be the emphasis on how do non-conventional funding sources and non-conventional procurement and, let's say, financing mechanisms bring the right kind of emphasis to these cities. You cannot tackle the whole problem at once. You've got to break it down into its component parts and identify the right collaborators to address them one step at a time. It is an incremental change. Is there anything the panelists want to add?
I would add that something that we see in the international development energy discussions is the idea of energy as the goal unto itself, and I think that can be a dead end. Instead of thinking of the road, so you might want to rephrase the thinking where the road isn't the end, the road is the means. So identifying it would be useful to identify what economic activity is not happening because you don't have the road. So, for example, if there's a port, so in Haiti, say there's a port, and you just want better distribution of goods coming into the port, I would think that the retailers in the city might have a vested interest in seeing a more effective infrastructure. And in that case, once you're in the realm of infrastructure and, as Dilla pointed out, you've pulled together your stakeholders, then it's incumbent upon the government of Haiti to take that argument to the development financial institutions such as the World Bank, such as the Inter-American Bank. And then my favorite example on the flip side, if you're figuring out the infrastructure to communicate from countryside to city, so bringing goods of the countryside into the city, et cetera, one might imagine that rail would actually be the most efficient way to do that. So instead of a hub and spoke system of roads, you would actually maybe have a depot and a railway and feeding into the depot, which would reduce further congestion into the city. And it was interesting because COP21 was this big success, but as I understood it, something that was not made overt was actually transportation. I don't think transportation was actually pointed to, and yet transportation is very much recognized as a major contributor, and there are a series of international activities around improving global transportation. There's this group called SLOCAT. I don't quite remember what it stands for, SLOCAT, and they're a coalition leading the charge from the UN to boost sustainable transportation, and they would have a lot to say, particularly in a developing or landlocked developing country context.
We have time for one last question. There's the lady in the back there.
Thank you. My name is Martine Kbevaluk. I'm Deputy Representative from France to IRENA. I was wondering if one shouldn't work to define public transportation policies at local level or national level. At what is the set of criteria on which you are going to base your policy? And I'm a little bit inclined to think that we are not perfect as humans, but I'm not very much in favor of punitive approach. I don't like it, and I don't think it works long term. But that set of criteria means that you certainly have different criteria for developed countries and developing countries, like Mr. Olsmeier underlined it. Telling people in developing countries go and use a bike, they use a bike, but in terrible conditions. So. In Paris, people might use their car, not because car is cheap. Car is very expensive in Paris, in suburbia. You live in the suburbia, have to use your car to go to Paris. It's very expensive, it's lengthy, but there are other reasons why people use a car. Issues like comfort. Nobody speaks about comfort. Why should we suffer? People are not looking for suffering. Flexibility and accessibility, I mean, number of things. So I was wondering, because we're working a little bit towards habitat-free, what are the kind of recommendations? I mean, it seems that a set of criteria, what is it what should guide policies? What is it what should maybe show a way to innovation, research, development, to companies? I mean, the kind of product we expect from them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I guess if there's no further questions, if I may summarize, since we're almost out of time, transport is only one part of the bigger issue that cities face. But the key for the future transportation, from what we've discussed so far, going right from the role of the private sector and how they can partner with governments in ensuring that energy transformation happens in a pragmatic but expedited manner. Jerry mentioned some of the emphasis on aviation and what you wouldn't conventionally consider transport, but in parts of the world, like here, for example, cities and economies kind of wrap around the aviation sector as part of the primary lifeblood of the economic transaction outside of oil. And Dr. Zhu talked about the emphasis on the integrated policy requirements and economic underpinnings of land use and transport. So cities are seen as a collaborative development exercise between people who live and make choices about where they live and work, and the government who manages how their mobility options are optimized. And Julie's also spoken to us about the value of looking at transport as a service and ensuring that the quality of service actually gets to the point where these behavior changes are actually manifested just because the alternative options are as competent as what you would consider conventional. So just in summary, the emphasis is there's a lot of very high and thought leadership that you will find in conferences like this. The emphasis, like the gentleman pointed out, on the need of the hour in developing countries is the ability to translate those ideas into a delivery package. And while having time-bound decisions on how we can collectively, with the power of the people, move towards change should be the focus of what I suggest we go away from this session.
And don't clap yet, because I want to put one more question to the panelists, making the connection with Habitat again. So since it's a UN summit, the idea is kind of what commitments can cities, countries make there? And I'm wondering, within the transport sector, what do you think is something that's sort of within reach that cities and countries could make? And then what's their kind of stretch targets? So just very quick, and sorry to put you on the spot with one or two top things, but this is the kind of thinking that we would like to get out of the session.
if I just think we need to, it was said this morning as well, to link it with the Sustainable Development Goals. So, because it's for UN Habitat, it's important to look, because the situations are very different within Western cities or cities from the north and the south. Even to answer a bit of that, the other question about, we had a big congress, a world congress that's called Velo City around bicycles, and you see that the concept of riding a bike is for the poor in the south, and in the north, in our cities, it's more the rich that begin to ride a bicycle. So it's a different perception. So it's how you implement, because everybody should have an access to transport and mobility, because it gives access to work, to food, to everything. So it is it should be in there, access to transport. Then there are different means, and it depends on the local situation.
And I think that's kind of, there's one very important issue that for many cities that is lacking or is not doing well in the public transit sector, is that a lot of the times they cannot figure out how to solve the last mile issue as well as the feeder system. Here in Abu Dhabi, and similarly to a lot of more sprawled cities in the US, is really when you get off the public transit system, like the light rail, there's no way that you can get to your destination within a certain time. And in the US, people's walking tolerance is about quarter mile. And here, given the heat in the summertime, 50 degrees Celsius, I guess that's going to be even less. How can we figure out different ways of combining the last mile issues and the feeder system to the public transit system? That's truly something will change our behavior.
If I may add to that, Anthony Merlo, I think in a previous session, very eloquently put it as governments should actually partner with cities in trying to create economic value capture from one of the primary assets that they have. And he was talking about land and the ability to kind of retain some bit of land in which they could actually leverage that land for whether it's public amenities or whatever the services that are required from a social justice point of view, or whether it is from environmental compliance point of view. I would actually go one step more than that and say that the ability for the governments to actually work in a way that the time-bound, it takes a lot of time to make governmental policy and regulations, but the private sector has a certain timeline as well to comply on the returns of investment that they get in adherence to those same policies. It is that the stretch target would be to work collectively to identify what are those timelines in which those regulatory mechanisms and the private sector responses to those mechanisms can actually result in sound business cases, which then would go into the point like what the other gentleman was saying. People would naturally gravitate to those because it is the best economic value.
Okay, if no further comments, then we will move to the next panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.